Hi, I'm Suna Verhoef. I'm a teacher at Pioneer School for the Visually Impaired in Worcester, South Africa. In this video, I will be talking about providing LTSM creatively. I started teaching at Pioneer School with no background in teaching learners with visual impairment. For over 20 years, universities in South Africa have not offered specialized diplomas for teachers of learners with visual impairment, and a generation of teachers have had to learn on the job or in service. The in-service training I received focused on reading and writing Braille and making material accessible to the learners. After a while, I felt that my teaching was not effective enough. Although reading material and maps were available in Braille, as well as in a sufficiently large font, learners were still not truly interested and enthusiastic. It was also clear that I was unable to convey certain aspects by merely describing them verbally. I was then introduced to the expanded core curriculum, and I immediately realized why my learners were not learning as effectively as they should have been. I then set out to apply the ECC in my daily teaching, and I started with the topic, the Trans-Saharan Trade Route, with my grade 7 class, 11, 12-year-olds. I will briefly take you back to my first attempts that will give you insight into my efforts and will highlight the humorous part of trying. I tried to apply two principles. The first principle is to use concrete examples and use experiences that learners might have had or can relate to. The second principle is to provide a complete experience. A good example of providing a complete experience is to involve a learner with planning to bake a cake, making shopping lists, literally going to the shop to buy and then baking it. So back to the trade route. I knew that it was important that I should lay down fundamental concepts such as what a camel is and a desert and what trade is. These concepts had to be in place before I could start telling them about the desert trade route and then move into teaching in a more narrative style, moving more towards history and away from basic concepts. So my first thought was that I should make a map that is more tactile and interesting. I imagined that touching a piece of jewelry made of gold and a feather that represented the ostrich would help learners to remember facts of the trade. The sand I glued onto the map symbolized the desert. The screws and string indicated the trade route itself. Those of you with common sense will have already identified the shortcomings in my planning. Basically, it was a disaster. Within minutes, after eager hands started exploring the map, the feather and the gold had come loose and fallen off. The sand was gone after only one learner tried to make sense of the random stretch of sand, and the string was broken. As the learners left my class that day, I felt very foolish. I had clearly gotten so carried away with my clever idea that I had not thought it through properly. But I decided to give it another go. I was not going to give up so easily. My first step was to inquire if there were any camels in the vicinity and whether we could go on an outing so that the learners could ride and feel them. It turned out to be an expensive idea and I had to abandon it. Well, if I couldn't find a real camel, I could buy a model of a camel. It took me weeks to find 6. I wanted one for each learner in my class. Camels are not popular in toy shops. I knew a model was not at all as effective as the real deal, but it had to do. And then I made a couple of other plans which I knew would be more effective than my first plan. And so the day of reckoning arrived. The learners entered and I handed them each a camel. They felt the camel and I started discussing the different features, comparing camels to horses and cows. Animals I thought the learners might have encountered or maybe touched before. Only 2 learners had. So I resorted to using the image of a dog times 50 in size. I felt my originality slipping again, but I forged ahead. The learners now knew all the features that make a camel uniquely suited to the desert. My next step was to play recordings of the sounds that camels make. Those are not pretty sounds, I can assure you. I found YouTube videos of camel sounds and videos of the sound of desert windstorms. The learners were fully engaged and responsive while I played the sounds. I then took them out of the classroom to the sand pit at the primary school, told them to take off their shoes and pretend to be camels. While they were walking through the sand, I had them imagine and explain why long legs would be advantageous, how a sandstorm might feel, how it is far more difficult to walk in sand when you are carrying a heavy load, and to imagine finding your way in a place where there are no streets and signs, only endless sand. In the following lesson, I did revision of the content by assigning each of the learners a role. I made one of them a merchant who wanted to sell his or her camel, and the other one the camel. They then had to sell their camel by advertising their camel's strengths. The most successful bid would receive a small voucher for the tuck shop. It was a very noisy lesson, with the learners all shouting out their bids, but everyone was involved, and it was quite funny to see camels talking. After all, the stock market and other trading places are often quite noisy. This brings me to the different aspects of the ECC that I tried to infuse during my lessons. In terms of orientation and mobility, we spoke about the different directions, north, south, east, and west. We spoke about how travelers in the desert orientate themselves in relation to the stars, the color of the dunes, and the wind, as very often GPS and Google Maps are not an option in the desert. We spoke about how camels' feet are adapted to the hot sand, and I told the learners about the special precautions blind people who own guide dogs have to take in very hot and very cold weather, protect their guide dogs' paws, and we discussed examples. We spoke about career options and specifically about trading in its many versions as a career option. They could connect this to two other subjects they take, namely business studies and life orientation. This interconnectedness between subjects is hugely important for understanding information and learning. In terms of daily living skills, we spoke about the ways the desert travelers would have had to preserve and ration food, and the months of preparation it must have taken. We spoke about how we also have to plan our money and food properly. In terms of social skills, we spoke about how leading a caravan group over 100 people would have been a huge challenge, and how each person would have been assigned a role and played their part. We spoke about how working in groups and playing your part is often necessary for survival. It is no exaggeration to say that the expanded core curriculum has changed teaching and learning in my classroom dramatically for the better. All of these principles, of course, apply for teaching in inclusive settings and make for richer learning and more meaningful experiences for all learners. The point is, however, that learners with full or limited vision have more opportunities to learn some of these concepts through incidental learning, for example, watching movies or seeing pictures in books. It is our responsibility as teachers of learners with visual impairment to bring this experience to the classroom and enrich our classes with sound, smells, tactile experiences, and movement. This does not only mean that your learners will be more involved and their learning will improve, but I can guarantee you that it will bring you joy as well and return you to the beginning of your career as a teacher and the roots of your passion.